evening, aviation aficionados. I'm Jamie Beckett, AOPA Foundation. You Can Fly ambassador for the East Coast. You also see Kay Sundaram down there, who covers the West Coast, and the lovely but talented Pat Brown, who does the Central United States. We're with you tonight, Tuesday night, August 9th, to talk about Before We Fly, because while we might think about, you know what, it's a beautiful day, I'm going to jump in the car, I'm going to run down the airport, I'll fling open the hangar door, get in the airplane, and go fly. That is not what the smart, safe pilot does. That's what the guy who's going in the trees does. So we're going to talk about it, but as always, we authorize you to bring up any topic you want in the comments. We'll do our best to address it. By the way, I do have to mention, in addition to Pat and Kay, we have Donnie McKay producing tonight behind the scenes from his underground hardened bunker. And you think I'm kidding? I'm not. Donnie is actually underground in a hardened bunker with this whole electronic morass of stuff. It's fairly incredible. So tip your waitress and let's get going with this. Pat, I think it's just something we have to bring up. The pre-flight begins at home way, way before the flight happens, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Taking stock of yourself, the old I'm safe, illness, medication, stress, alcohol, fatigue, emotion, or eating, depending on which model you're looking at. And you're teasing me before, but yes, I'm going to recite from the Book of Regs. 91.103 says you got to be aware of all available information. And it enumerates several of those things in the first couple of paragraphs. So if you're not familiar with good old 91.103, you might want to read that. So you betcha.
I'm going to tease you forever, but you know what? You need to know somebody who knows the regs, or you need to actually read them yourself. But you and I have had these conversations over and over. I actually like being familiar with the regs, because then when something comes up, I know if I'm on the sunny side of this or not. It's much better than, well, my buddy down at the coffee shop said this. Well, the FAA or the NTSB accepts that.
Yeah, or better yet, Facebook says.
Absolutely. Along those lines, I recently read a comment, and this is not a pre-flight thing. I read a comment from a guy on social media who said his flight instructor was encouraging him not to trim in the pattern because it's confusing. No, that's not the way that works at all. Okay, you fly a Cirrus out there in California. Great airplane, great part of the country. What do you do like the day before, the night before you have a planned trip? Just not the whole shebang, but just the basics of what do you do to prepare yourself?
Well, it's not even the night before. It's a few days before. I'm constantly looking at the weather. We all know that term, the outlook briefing, which is typically you get that the night before. But ideally, you would be checking weather patterns a few days out, depending on where you're flying. If it's a longer flight, you want to understand the different weather patterns, not just where you're departing and en route, but your destination and also alternates. And so keep an eye on it, because the trends give you a lot of information. So get that outlook briefing definitely the night before, and then get your standard briefing before you leave home. And then you want to get an updated or an abbreviated briefing. But this is all weather related. One other thing that I do for notices to airmen, specifically for TFRs, other NOTAMs, is that I call before I'm about to start. We've been getting lots of pop-up TFRs, and even if you did your due diligence and got that outlook and standard abbreviated briefing, within minutes, you can suddenly be faced with a TFR. So make sure, just call, and all you have to do is advise the briefer that you've gotten your full weather briefing. You just want to get an update on the NOTAMs, or you can, of course, do that with your electronic flight bag, which is, I know, a way that a lot of pilots do. I do also. It's nice and easy, and it's very thorough, and you also have a good record of you getting that information.
Outstanding. By the way, Martin Kastenbaum is on the line. Always good to see Martin back. Thank you for coming. Denise Mangold says some of the regs are confusing. I disagree. I think they're all confusing. You need a lawyer sitting next to you when you read them. And Denise says, I'm planning on continuing flying when I'm done with cancer treatments. Denise, best of luck to you. I think that's awesome. You got something to look forward to, and you're going to get back to it. And Danny Carson says, I like to call weather briefer for a weather briefing. Pat, I'm a big fan of 1-800 Weather Brief. I know the website is there. I like the phone call because I'm old school. How do you use the Outlook briefing? I mean, where would you do that? The day before, a week before, and what would your planning process be like?
Well, I'm kind of Kay's mind. We actually flew up to Oshkosh, as our viewers know, because 2 weeks ago, I was doing this from the basement with a cell phone. But I started looking at the weather on the Weather Channel, frankly, probably a good 4 or 5 days out, knowing that things change, but weather forecasting is getting better and better. So I'll start that way. Sometimes I'll call for an Outlook briefing the night before, but usually I'll have my route in ForeFlight, and I'll start taking a look at that point at the surface analysis chart and the progs and all that good stuff. I'll go to aviationweather.gov and look at the graphical forecast for aviation. That GFA is amazing. And then I'll call for a briefing before I leave in the morning. And if I'm leaving within a few minutes, that's what I'll do. I'll just get a standard briefing. But if it's going to be any kind of length of time in between, I'll do an abbreviated briefing just to get the last minute updates. And then, but I do like talking to an individual because you have your voice on tape, asking specifically. Hopefully, you've asked specifically, are there any TFRs along the route? And it's hard. It's hard for you to be vilified by the FAA if you've got yourself on tape asking specifically for that information, and perhaps it wasn't given to you. At least you've got a plausible defense.
Yeah, I got to admit, I've become less of a Luddite over the years, and I use a lot more of online services. I use ForeFlight pretty extensively to get my briefings. And it does depend, am I going on a relatively short flight, less than 100 miles, less than an hour, or am I going on a longer flight where I might be crossing several states? My planning process is different, but even if I'm just local, before I leave the pattern, I'll at least get an abbreviated briefing. I'll call 1-800 Weather Brief. I'll talk to a briefer, and for that exact point, Pat, I want to say on tape, are there any TFRs or NOTAMs at my destination, my departure point, or in between? And they're going to give them to me in English. I don't have to decode the whole thing. But I like having it on tape so I know what's coming up, and I've got a really good handle on what's happening. I think the thing we really want to impart to people here is there's a lot of possibilities, and you're right, the online services are fantastic, but if you didn't log in with a login and password, there's no record that you got a briefing, and that might be of great interest to your insurance company later should something happen. So it really is worth either making that phone call, as Danny Carson likes to do, even though he also uses ForeFlight, or just make that phone call because it's easy and it's nice to talk to a human being. That's my story.
Yeah. The thing about the briefing, self briefing is awesome. I do it frequently, and encourage people to do so. If you go to print out a self-briefing, depending on the length of the trip, and there's no joke. I mean, it could be that thick. Mm-hmm. And the point that I make to students when I'm talking to them about these things, and applicants, in the debrief after a check ride, is self-briefing is terrific. It really is. But if you're thumbing through a briefing that's that thick, what are the chances that you're going to see that one FDC NOTAM that is regulatory in nature that might sink your boat if you don't know it, or that one TFR that popped up unexpectedly, or and when it's an 8-point font, some people have trouble with that. I'm a big fan of self-briefing, but at the same time, calling a briefer, doing it the old-fashioned way, so it's hard to beat.
Hey, Kay,
Yeah,
I want
that's
to add
absolutely.
one
I'm
other.
sorry. Go ahead, Kay.
Add one other thing. You can combine the two also. You can go ahead and log in into your account, whether it's on iPad or computer. I use my iPad and I log in through my ForeFlight account. So there is a record that way that,
Yeah.
yes, I did, and when I did that, and everything is downloaded. And then you can call and have all those images right at your fingertips. So that's a nice way to supplement, because I'm a very visual person. I got to be able to see it. And so if I call on the phone, I like to be looking at the same thing that the briefer is. So by all means, do the online first, and then you can call to supplement, particularly if you have any questions.
Yeah.
That's great points. Now, of course, we are going to get in the car at some point and drive down to the airport, or get on the bicycle, or if you're very lucky, walk across the ramp from your airport home. We all have an interesting story about a very, very simple thing that's very common at the airport and is a real danger if you don't have a rule about it. Kay, I want to talk about tow bars, because for a little piece of metal, an enormous amount of damage can be done if you don't take care. And you have a really good personal rule for how to deal with tow bars. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, Jamie, you and I were just talking about that earlier, and I have a rule that the tow bar never leaves your hand. So you get it out of the airplane from the baggage compartment. Some of them you got to put together, right? You attach it to the airplane, you push, pull, whatever it is that you need to do. And then again, it never leaves your hand. You take it off and then you put it right back in the airplane where it belongs. And don't put it in the back seat. You don't want that as an obstacle getting in your way. So put it back in the baggage. But if you follow that rule that the tow bar never leaves your hand, you're not going to be in any of those embarrassing situations. And I'm sure a lot of us have heard people taxiing, even taking off with a tow bar attached. That will not happen.
Yeah, there actually are pictures out on social media of airplanes in flight with the tow bar still hanging there. And Pat, you actually had a personal thing where there was like a little bit of a mind fade and a recollection that kind of saved your butt. Wasn't that the case?
Well, it was more dumb luck than anything. This has been probably 10 or 12 years ago, maybe more. It was the first 182 that I had a partnership in, and we had one of those. Everybody knows one of those blue-colored tow bars that where you have to squeeze it to open it up to get around the wheel. And I remember pulling the airplane out of the hangar, and then getting distracted. And I don't remember if I was solo or with somebody, but getting distracted. But nevertheless, getting in the airplane and starting the engine. And about the time it caught, thinking, oh, wait a minute, the tow bar is still on the airplane. And obviously shut the airplane down right that minute and got out. And I'll tell you what, fortune favors the foolish sometimes, because there was probably that much clearance between the propeller and the tow bar. So no harm, no foul. But I do have a friend who left the tow bar on there and caught it with about a half an inch down from the tip of the propeller. And, of course, trashed the propeller, trashed the tow bar, and ended up having to tear the engine apart. So it can happen to anybody. It really, really can. I love Kay's your rule of it never leaves your hand. That's a really good rule.
I like that one too. And by the way, Martin, it makes a great comment on our last point. Gary Reeves at Oshkosh suggesting if your instrument rated and current, file IFR and TFRs won't be a problem for you. That's absolutely true. There's a whole slew of tools we have available to us, so make use of them. And Pat, on the tow bar point, I actually helped some folks start a flying club here in Florida, and they bought an absolutely beautiful Cessna Cardinal, and it only had 75 hours on the engine. I mean, this plane was immaculate maintained. It was just beautiful. And a member and a CFI fired it up with the tow bar still attached, had a prop strike, just like your friend. You need a new tow bar, a new prop, and an engine teardown. And boy, your insurance company is not happy that they just accepted this policy, and now they've got a big payout. So you're right. It could be anybody. It's not a low-time pilot problem. It's an all-time pilot problem. Kay's suggestion is a great one. I've never actually heard it put that way, Kay. I've always just told people never walk away from the tow bar. It should never, even if you've moved the airplane and then you've got to go pick something up over there and come back. No, you take the tow bar off, then walk over and pick it up, then come back. That's my rule, but I like Kay's better.
Yeah, I do too.
Well, let's talk about the walk around, because now that we've driven out to the airport, we've got our briefings. It's a nice day. We've pulled the airplane out of the hangar. Beg your pardon. I think over time, and this is just a personal opinion based on observation, people tend to get a little lax on the walk around after they've been doing this sort of thing a while. And I'll give you an example. I was an instructor in Connecticut, and it was early spring, still patches of snow on the ground. And the guy came out and loaded his family into the airplane, untied it, jumped in, fired it up, and then went out there to fly. And he starts racing down the runway, and then full power, full brakes, and then no brakes, no power, and full power, no brakes. He's just all over the place. Horses it into the air, just barely gets it into the air, and the ground drops off after the runway. He went with it, tore the gear off, opened the fuel bladders. It was just a mess. Thankfully, nobody was seriously hurt, all because he did not do a walk around and forgot to take the pitot cover off. And halfway down the runway, he had no airspeed and was in such a kerfuffle, he couldn't get the throttle and the brakes coordinated. And man, that's a bad one. Just the simple walk around is such an important thing, Kay, that we have to have our checklist in our hand, or a flow check that we use the same way every time. Do you have any special things you do with your walk around that you're checking the inspection of the plane, that anything's unusual? I mean, you've been away from it. Who knows?
Right. The first time that I ever fly a new type of airplane, I like to look at what's in the POH. There's a lot of sources of information out there, particularly on the internet, but the one that you should always be going to is that aircraft manufacturer's pilot operating handbook, because that is the official source. And so if you're flying a new make or model for the first time, take the time and go through that POH. We all did that when we were student pilots. We got to know the POH really well. We had to for the written exam and portions of the oral exam, but then we kind of gets put on a bookshelf, and that's not good. You really need to be familiar with that, and the POH is going to explain every little detail in the amplified section of the pre-flight section, and be familiar with that. Now, if this is an airplane that you're flying all the time, then my recommendation is to go with the flow, and I like to start like in a 172 at the static port and walk all the way around, and then go back and take a look at the checklist, just to make sure that you didn't miss anything. And let me step back one thing further. Before I even start that walk around, I have a habit of always checking the fuel and oil first. And there's two reasons. Because if there's anything that is abnormal with fuel or oil, or if you smell anything, that's going to be a showstopper. So why do all the pre-flight and then find out that there's a problem with your fuel system? And then the other reason I like to start with checking the fuel first is because if I need fuel, like say in a flying club, they hadn't topped it off and somebody flew before, then I got to give a call, and that could take about 15-20 minutes before I get the fuel. So I like to do that first, and then I start and I do my walk around, and then I pull out the checklist and take a look. So
I do the same thing. I sump the fuel first before I even move the airplane, because the drains are at the low point. I don't want to get the fuel agitated at all. If there's any water that's settled or any debris, I want to know about it. So I check the fuel and oil first as well. But I'll tell you, there might be there's a comfort level. We're flying the same plane all the time. We just get in the habit of doing a walk around. I do a fairly careful walk around, but I'll tell you, I took an airplane I had once in for an annual, and the kid washing the plane before they did the annual, just the kid washing the plane, noticed the water was running funny down the rudder, and got a magnifying glass and looked, and sure enough, one of the attach points was cracked. I hadn't picked up on that, and that's a biggie. I mean, that really could have been an issue. So it doesn't matter if you're a student pilot or if you're a 20-year veteran of flying, taking the time to really look at the airplane, if it's the first time you've flown it or the 35,000th, you're really looking at it. Are there fasteners missing? Is there something loose? Do the brake pads still have meat on them? Pat, we've flown together. I've seen you get out there and you really look at the airplane. Do you have anything that you particularly key on after all these years?
Well, if I'm flying a retractable gear airplane, of course, I'm going to pay particular attention to the squat switches and make sure that they look like they're in good shape. Certainly don't want the gear coming up when we're on the ground. I'm checking the oil, checking the fuel, and pretty much everything that both of you have elaborated on. So I can't really add much to that. I would simply add to the fact that if the airplane has recently come out of maintenance, you really want to look at it closely. We had a situation where a friend of mine was taking off out of a neighboring airport after the airplane had come out of annual, and at about 500 feet, the engine quit, and he was able to turn back, get to the airport safely. Everything was fine. They towed it over to the shop on that airport that had not done the annual, and the mechanic found a cracked intake manifold, and it had some effect on the mixture, and the conditions were just right that the engine quit. They fixed the issue with the exhaust manifold in a matter of a few hours, and he flew the airplane home, and it's been fine ever since. But here's an airplane that had been an annual, and that could have ended up badly. So when it comes out of annual, you're not likely to be able to check some of that stuff because it's under the hood, and some airplanes you've got to take the cowling off to be able to even see the engine. That makes it a little bit more difficult, but caution is the key when it's just come out of annual, especially if something major's been done.
You're not kidding. One of the things I'm really pleased, the flight school I'm involved with, we have a maintenance department, and we have a quality control check before an airplane leaves maintenance. Somebody else looks over the airplane beyond the mechanic who worked on it, because you're right. People can become distracted. They can miss something, and sometimes it could be a big thing. By the way, Chris Ruff, viewer Chris Ruff, and I are going to become close friends because he points out it is hard to have a prop strike on a tailwheel tow bar. That is very true. Not hard to have a prop strike on a tail dragger, but certainly hard to have it on the tow bar. And Eric Pittman, we could say Eric Pittman is a fan of Ask the Ambassador, but I think it's more fair to say I'm a fan of Eric Pittman, who is this evening on the Redneck Riviera. He has left South Carolina. He has come down to the Gulf Coast, apparently. Welcome to the party, Eric. I'll tell a story on myself. When I was a young pilot, I was a high wing guy. I'm still a high wing guy. I generally like them. Cubs, Champs, 152s, 172s. It's just my thing. I adapted to them a long time ago. But I was assigned to fly a Piper Warrior, and I was dressed for work. So I was trying very hard not to get my pants dirty. And to do a good pre-flight on a Piper Warrior, you have to get on the ground. And I didn't. And I did a very cursory pre-flight. And thank goodness an instructor came out and took a look at the airplane. And he was fuming mad, and should have been. Because what I had missed is on the underside of the wing, there was a 2-inch strip of metal missing from the leading edge to the trailing edge, because the runway was being extended at our airport. And instead of having the big yellow X out there, somebody had put out a bunch of sawhorses. And the guy who rented the airplane last landed right on top of one of those sawhorses, tore out a whole strip of metal from the underside of the wing, tied down the airplane, didn't say anything to anybody. It really could have been a tragic thing. And it was the last time I was lazy on a pre-flight, because it has really stuck with me. That could have been really catastrophic. And thank goodness that instructor came out and saved my bacon. So it could happen to any of us, as you say, Pat. But I mean, it's just a momentary dumbness. Like, I don't want to get my knees dirty. And you missed something really big. Kay, do you have a special checklist? Because, I know people who do the pre-flight with the checklist, and I will be honest, I don't. I have a flow check. I check the same stuff every time, and I'm fairly thorough. Actually, I think I'm very thorough, except for that one cracked rudder attach point. But do you use a checklist out of the POH, or do you have your own, or what do you work with? Oh, I think Kay might be frozen.
I think
I don't mean literally.
there she.
There's several companies out there that have some good checklists, and I like this particular one that's laminated, and it is two-sided, so you have all of your checklist items on one, and you have emergency procedures on the other. But what I really like about this is, you can take a Sharpie and mark it up, and you want to do that. You don't want to use any generic checklist, because I guarantee you there's going to be something on there that you don't necessarily like. For example, on this one, this happens to be a 172 S model, and everywhere it says, heading indicator to compass. And this plane has a vertical compass card, so that's not applicable. And so you just take the Sharpie and cross it off. And then there's other things that I write in there because I tend to forget. So use that Sharpie and mark it up. You can use the one from the POH. It is a lot longer, but as you're walking around, you can go with your flow procedure and then use some checklist. It doesn't matter what brand, but the one that works for you. And I like this one in particular because the speeds are also there. And then on the back of it is the emergency. Instead of having multiple pieces of paper or plastic cards, I like it to just have one and a size that I can put on my clipboard. Or if you're one of those folks who like things on the yoke, you can mount it on the yoke. But try not to put it somewhere where it could fall. You want to have that secure. Just like your electronic devices, you also want your paper and checklist, all that in the airplane to be secured. So this is the one that works for me.
Outstanding. And Pat, as often as we do the walk around, we do the run up, maybe even more often, because some people go out and fly out second flight of the day without doing a walk around. Do you have a special method you use when you do the run up on any given airplane?
Well, the first thing I do is reach for the checklist, and that's one thing I'm absolutely militant about on the run up. There's just a lot of stuff there, and I just want to make sure that I don't miss it. One of the things, and I use the same kind of I think it's called Checkmate, that checklist that Kay was waving around there a minute ago. I use that for the 182 and for the Comanche, as a matter of fact. But one of the things that I tend to forget to do if I've flown into a towered field is to switch the transponder back to 1200. And I can't tell you the number of times I've taken off and the tower has said, Comanche 123, squawk 1200, and it's embarrassing. So it's now penciled in on the checklist so that I don't forget to do that, either when I shut down or when I start up again and start going through the run up or what have you. At some point before we take off, it's back at 1200, and just adding it to the checklist is a big deal. But every airplane is different. I mean, you run it up to X RPMs. Some at 1700, some at 1800, some at 2000. Some you have to do a prop check, to make sure the governor's working. Some are fixed pitch. Some require leaning for takeoff. Some don't. I mean, it's whatever the flavor of the day is, you want to be using the checklist for it. Sure.
Yeah, and even beyond that, it can help keep your head in the game when you're just a little foggy. I was checking out a guy in an older 182 once, carbureted 182, and I think very wisely he had the habit of leaning pretty aggressively while taxiing, because the mixture's pretty rich and it can foul plugs and stuff. And especially down here in Florida, we do that. I suspect you do it in Texas and California as well, but I don't know. Anyhow, we get out to do the run up and he pulls the checklist and he's doing his thing. And when he tries to go up to 1700 RPMs to do the mag check, and it's just popping and banging and kicking, and it's horrible. And so he decides to do the run up a little lower, not 1700 RPMs. And when he pulls the carb heat on, instead of the RPMs dropping, the RPMs go up. And he's just totally, I don't know why this is happening. This is weird. Well, he had leaned to taxi and hadn't enriched, which is on the checklist, when he got to the run up. And what's happening is it's too lean to give you full power, and it's starting to get into detonation. But when you pull the carb heat on, you're enriching the mixture. It has more fuel in the fuel air mixture, so the RPMs go up. That checklist can keep you from doing something dumb or from damaging your engine, frankly. I mean, things can happen. And by the way, Pat, I have also neglected to change to 1200 and turned everything on, and somebody has to give me a call. So thank you for giving me the comfort to know it's not just me.
Oh, no. I suspected each one of us has done that a time or two.
We've got a question from RJ, PIC. I like that, RJ. That's confident. He's from Chino, okay? He's in your neighborhood. Do you all run through the checklist quickly because you've flown the aircraft dozens of times, or do you take time and go line by line? You know, I think the answer to that, RJ, is in a story that you've had, Pat, of somebody who's at the hold short line doing their run-up, and it's taking a long time, and they just go back to the hangar. So remember we were talking about that at one time?
Basically, you just told the story. So.
But why? But why did they do that?
I'm just kidding. This is one day I had a student in the left seat. We're flying circuits at the airport, and there was an airplane down there, and it would just, he kept sitting there just over and over and over again as we touch down and go around. And finally, after about the fourth or fifth circuit, I see him taxiing back to the hangar. Well, I knew the guy in the airplane, so a day or two later, I saw him and I asked him, what was the matter with the airplane? And it wasn't mechanical. It was he just said, something in my head just wasn't in the game. Mm-hmm. And so, while it doesn't relate directly to RJ's question, here's a case where, for whatever reason, perhaps he was being particularly picky going through the checklist or whatever to make sure he hadn't forgotten anything, or for whatever the reason, he just decided that today was not the day to go commit aviation. Personally, I am, as I said earlier, I'm pretty militant about the pre-takeoff checklist. My finger is following each individual line item, and I generally say it out loud. Even if I'm by myself in the airplane, it's, RPMs 1800 or whatever it might be, depending on the airplane, and check prop and check mags, and, what's the mag drop. And I was I was test flying a decathlon. This is probably a week ago or so, and it had some work done on it. It was time to test fly it. And I got to the run-up area, and I ran up to 1800 RPMs, which is a recommended RPM for that. And I reached back behind me, where the switches are on those airplanes, and turned off one mag and got a 225 RPM drop. Put it back on and turn the other one off, and a 225 RPM drop. Now, the only good thing about that is that they were the same amount. But obviously that's not good. Well, what could be wrong? So I tried leaning the mixture some, and I got about a 200 and some odd RPM rise. So I throttled back to 1800 RPMs and did the mag check, and I got a 25 RPM drop on one and a 50 RPM drop on the other. So it was a matter of the engine, the idle had been set too rich. Perfectly safe to go fly. But you definitely, if you know that's to be the case, you want to taxi with the mixture pulled out, so you're not loading up the plugs with a too rich mixture on the ground. Now, there's some other issues. This is a fuel injected engine, so the fuel sensor box underneath the engine, I think, may have some issues. But that's a case where you really want to go through the checklist line item by line item, and don't skip anything.
And that's to Eric Pittman's point. He says he's read stuff on the checklist and skipped right over it, even though he read it. It's a read and do list. And I will often say it out loud as I go along, even if I'm alone, because it just makes it easier. It's a habit from being with students, but even alone, I'll say it out loud. And, you make a great point, because you get some mag drops. We get into that thing where we're switching from one mag to another, and we're just, something happened. It moved. Sometimes you'll get a bigger mag drop on one side than the other. That might be a fouled plug. You lean it out and you run it up and it burns that off. But Kay, what if we're doing a run up and we're just getting into that thing? I click the key over and something happens. What if I don't see a mag drop? Does that mean my engine's just so pristine, everything's good, or is that a problem?
No, that's a problem. You should be getting a mag drop. And in fact, I had that happen one time in an airplane where there was some miswiring, and the airplane was actually being operated only on one mag. The other one was not even connected properly, and so of course, when you go do the mag drop, it doesn't drop. And so this is where it's important to know, well, what should you expect? You're not just looking for gauges in the green or just going through the motion. All right, I'm going to put the RPM at 1700. I'm going to click to the right and then look for a drop. You want to understand what's actually going on. If you have some engine instrumentations, then you should be able to tell, all right, what's happening to the temperatures. They're rising when you drop to one mag. When you come back, then they could lower back down, and really understand what's going on. And if you do have those extra instrumentation, make sure you get a briefing on that. Some of them are intuitive what you're looking for, but there's a wealth of information, and it's not that obvious. You do need to sit on the ground and just learn. It's not going to take that much time. Sit with the CFI and make sure that you understand all the instrumentation on board and what to look for and why those needles are moving the way they are.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. We can use that time where we're doing the run up and taxiing and preparing to fly to get us comfortable using those instruments, and even the ones maybe we don't think about. When I went on my spin training flight when I was in flight school, it got weathered out twice. So by the time we got to the third one, I'm starting to get pretty nervous now because it's been canceled. And you've got to climb up to a pretty good altitude in a Cessna 152 to do spins so that you can recover before 1,500 feet, Pat. I think that's in the ACS. But while we're climbing, the oil pressure keeps dropping and the oil temperature keeps climbing, which kind of indicates there's something wrong. I don't have to know what's wrong, but it should have stabilized at some point, even in a climb. And when you realize, hey, that's not what I was seeing on the ground, and that's not what I ought to see, and that's not what I normally see, let's go land preemptively. And Pat, we both have that where we've had an issue in the plane, not a disaster, but something's wrong, and we make a preemptive landing to get it checked out. But let's go back to the ground, Pat. We're talking about before you fly is the overall concept, and we've done all the briefings and we've stowed our tow bar appropriately, made sure all the doors are closed and all that. When we get out to the runway, we don't just want to go. It might be wise if we actually brief our passengers on what their role is, if they have one, and even something as simple as how do the seat belts work? Because they're not all the same in an airplane, are they?
No, they're not. And it's actually, once again, it's in the regs that says you have to do a pre-flight briefing, or a passenger briefing, I should say. And typically that would include things like how to buckle the seat belt and unbuckle it, how to handle the shoulder harness and whether or not you need to wear it all the time, assuming the airplane has one, and how to open and close the doors and windows. I'm just trying to think of a sterile cockpit. That would be a really important thing, is a sterile cockpit. So, thank you, Donnie, for putting that up, because that's a really good reminder right there. So a sterile cockpit for the first few minutes of the flight, and obviously help me watch for traffic. If you see something, say something, even if it's during the sterile cockpit portion of the flight. If you see an airplane that seems dangerously close, point it out so that we don't become one. So those are the kind of things that you should be talking to your passengers about. If you're flying by yourself or with another pilot, it's probably not a bad idea to talk about, all right, if the engine starts to give me trouble when I'm still on the runway, we're going to close the throttle and bring the airplane to a stop. If we can land shortly after rotation, we're just going to land back on the runway, bring the airplane to a stop. But you should also be giving some thought to what happens if you have some engine problems when you get to some sort of an altitude. One of the things that I hear a lot of flight schools teaching their students is just kind of by rote, well, when I get to 1,000 feet, I'm going to turn around and come back to the airport. No, not necessarily. ASI did a really super video. Richard McSpadden and the group. I think Dave Hirschman was involved, and maybe some of the other folks, where they compared a Bonanza, I think a 172, an RV, and a J3 in the so-called impossible turn coming back to an airport up there in Frederick. And a couple of the airplanes made it back. A couple of them didn't in their test. So you can't just by rote say that by a certain altitude, I'm going to turn around and come back to the traffic pattern, because that may not be the case. Anyway, so, but I digress a little bit. You might not want to verbalize that if you have non-flying passengers in the airplane, but you certainly want to think about it. In the glider world, we use A, B, C, 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 D, E, altimeter, belts, controls, cable, canopy, D for direction of wind, and E for emergencies. So you're actually verbalizing all of that stuff before you give them the takeoff signal. So that, and we don't typically, I don't typically see that being taught quite that way in power, but thankfully I see it taught. At least they're teaching their students to think about that stuff, and we could all take a lesson from that.
Yeah, absolutely. By the way, Eric Pittman has a very good question, and I'm going to entertain you with a true story after that. But Eric says, when is it absolutely required to wear a shoulder harness? And I'm not going to ask an ambassador on this, even though Eric meant to. I'm going to ask the audience, where would you find the answer to that question? And it's not in Reader's Digest, so that's off the table. But seriously, one of the most important skills you can develop as a pilot is, where do I find the information I need? So, Eric, I'm relying on your fellow viewers. They're going to advise you on where you find that information. And while they're typing furiously on their tiny little telephone keyboards, just a little bit of a thing, I'm going to say I think the seatbelt briefing is overlooked, and it's tragic that it is, because it's rare. But every once in a while, something goes bad, and it's a problem. I have a friend who's got a very successful airline career. He's a really successful pilot. He's done very well. But his first ever plane ride was at a private field where someone offered him a ride. And he's a kid, 13, 14 years old, excited. This is going to be great. And he jumps in the airplane and he belts in. The pilot belted him in. Everything's great. This is so exciting. They took off. The engine quit. The airplane crashed, caught on fire. The pilot died in the crash. The kid had no idea how to get the seatbelt off, and it was one of those over-center latches. It's not like a car seatbelt. He was burnt pretty badly. Thankfully, somebody got him out of the airplane. He did recover, and he's had a great career. But that could have been a double fatality, just because somebody forgot to say, by the way, this is how you put the seatbelt on. This is how you take it off. Let me see you do it. And good. And I often do that with people. Fasten your seatbelt, unfasten your seatbelt. Great. Now fasten it, and we're going to go fly. But that's well worth it. Air J comes up with 91,107. Martin Cassenbob comes up with 91,107. I would have accepted the FARs, Part 91, or the regs. So we're doing very well. And Eric Pittman is impressed. So Eric Pittman, you just learned something from your viewers, not even the ambassadors. Know where it is in the regs. And of course, you can always call Pat at home, because he has the whole thing in his memory.
Hey, Jamie, I want to say one more thing about the seatbelts. Some viewers might be thinking, well, seatbelt's just a seatbelt. It's pretty straightforward, and it's not, as we've been alluding to. There's some are a little more complicated. It's same as doors. You really have to demonstrate in some airplanes, how do you open the door properly, and why, if it gets jammed, what do you do? Or do you have a tool to knock out the window, or where should you hit it? So those are things that you absolutely want to let passengers know. And the baggage door also could be very well, could be an emergency exit. So those are things that you got to point out. It's not obvious to many people.
Now, Kay, I'm going to come right back to you, because you opened the door and that's it. Now you're being punished. The part of our run up and pre-flight, getting everything ready, is making sure our directional gyro is aligned with our compass. But when we roll out on the runway, we can use that directional gyro and compass for a whole other purpose, can't we?
Yes, yes. So there's that little heading bug on the DG, right? I like to put the runway numbers on that heading bug. That really helps you with situational awareness as you're taxiing along, particularly in more complex airports. And I got a number of them around here in Southern California. Now, I will admit that if you have parallel runways, it's not going to tell you which one you're on, but at least it'll guide you to making sure that you're aligned. And you do want to double check when you roll onto the runway that that bug is right in front of you at the top. And so that's a good use of that. And in general, in flight, you should be, using that heading bug. One of my recent instructors told me he had this saying, a dead bug, dead pilot. And the reason that phrase came up is because of this sophisticated autopilot that was in the airplane. And if you ever put that in the heading mode and the heading bug is all the way 180 degrees, that autopilot is going to swing towards wherever that heading bug is. So it's always important to have that as close to your actual heading as possible. But I like to use that on the ground before takeoff, and I set my runway numbers on that. And you should do the same with the altitude bugs. And you don't have to have fancy equipment. There's even little suction things that you can put on the instrument that has a little arrow that goes around. You can just put that on the altitude that you're planning to level off at as a nice reminder.
Yeah, that's a great one. Pat, one of the things that got me early on in training was radio frequencies, because there's this little button on the yoke, and I really found out in a very embarrassing fashion, it doesn't call who you want to call, it calls who's set in the radio. It just uses that frequency. So if I'm set to 121.5 because my instructor and I were talking about using guard, and I push the button and talk, I'm not talking to the tower. I'm talking to 121.5. And if you have anything to offer on tips or tricks or just how somebody might make sure they don't make that mistake, I would appreciate it. And while we're on that point, I would like the audience to put in the comments a promise they will not say last call when they depart non-towered airports.
Yes.
I hate that. I really hate that.
I do too. Oh God, I do too.
But yeah, do you have a mental trick for how you deal with radio frequencies and staying on top of the fact, like you were talking about resetting the transponder 1200? Do you have a mental trick to make sure I'm not calling the old frequency and
Yeah, it's almost like this was preordained, because AirJ says, "Hey Pat, does this bug you aviators using incorrect terminology on the radio when talking to ATC?" Is exactly, it came up the minute you started talking about that. Well, I don't know this particular trick, but if I'm going to be flying a cross country of any duration, I have a little book that sits on my lap or in my co-pilot's lap. And if it's my wife, it's her. If it's my partner in the airplane, it's him. And we're writing down the frequencies as they give them to us. And we're writing down the controlling agency name, Houston Approach, Dallas, or Fort Worth Regional, or Mizzou or Memphis, or wherever. I'm thinking about those that occurred when we flipped Oshkosh. But I want a breadcrumb trail of all the frequencies that we talk to. And some people say, well, why do you bother with that? Because you've got the flip-flop function on your radio, and that's absolutely true. I can always flip-flop back to the previous frequency. But what happens if something happens? I can't imagine all of the scenarios where something might go wrong, where maybe I lost that flip flop, or who knows what. But if I have a history of the frequencies that I've been speaking to, at least I've got a fighting chance of getting one of them perhaps back on the air. I mean, worst case scenario, just go to flight service above 5,000 feet, 122.2, and at least you may be able to talk to somebody and get some help. But I just write the frequencies down, or I have the person in the right seat write the frequencies down, and we literally build a breadcrumb. And it was actually helpful to us coming back from Oshkosh, because as we were handed off to these various sectors, we knew, okay, well, we're with Mizzou right now. We're going to get handed off to Memphis in a few minutes. Let's just go ahead and put Memphis frequency in there. And so, and we made it a game. Is that the frequency we're going to get? And about half the time we were right, about half the time we were wrong. But it didn't, in the day, it didn't really matter, because if we were wrong, we'd still have to flip the frequency, even if we hadn't anticipated what it was. So it was just kind of a fun game to play. But that's just probably, if that's a trick, that's mine.
That works. It keeps it front of mind. By the way, I really do like this. Christopher Ritchie says, you forgot about a pre-takeoff briefing, generally introduced at the commercial pilot level. I must admit that somebody mentioned this to me. I had a chief pilot years ago that mentioned it, and it's absolutely true. When we fly multi-engine, before we cross the hold short line onto the runway, we brief the person in the other seat. If we lose an engine before rotation, we're going to retard the throttles, bring it to a stop, get off the runway. If we lose an engine after rotation, but with runway remaining, we're going to retard the throttles, get back on the ground, get it under control, get off the runway. If we lose an engine after rotation with no runway left, we're going to clean it up. We're going to feather the dead engine. We're going to get ourselves around the pattern and make a decision on where we're going to go if we have any climb. Absolutely true. I rarely hear people do that in single engines. Pat, Kay, have either of you seen any kind of formalized pre-takeoff briefing that people do in singles?
Absolutely. Yeah, I encourage doing that before every takeoff, no matter what airplane you're in, because sometimes you forget, what elevation you're at, and what is the traffic pattern now. It's not always 1,000. That's only if you're at sea level, right? And so if you're at an airfield where it's 1,400 and the traffic pattern is 2,400, it gives you an idea of, all right, what do I need to climb to actually be in the traffic pattern. In the Cirrus, we always call out what our caps, the Cirrus airframe parachute system, and we say 500 feet AGL. At that point, we're going to pull caps. We have a hard deck, and that's 2,000 AGL. So at my home base, where the elevation is 330, I like to remember the number. All right, 850. So I'll immediately pull caps if I have any problems once I get to that altitude. Below that, I'm going to land straight ahead, and similar to the briefing that you just mentioned with the multi-engine. But then we also call out, all right, I will not go below 2,300. If I'm above that, I'm going to give myself time and troubleshoot, but that's my hard deck. So that you do before you even call the tower and say you're ready for takeoff. So you have those numbers in your mind, you have it written out, you know exactly what your runway length is. So it's absolutely critical, I think, in every single takeoff. Plus, it's an opportunity to remember, well, what is on the departure end? At my home field, we got a nice golf course, but it's hilly, and there are a lot of power lines to the left. So you are going to go to the right if you're smart. So that's something that you should know well before you get on that runway. And it's nice to share that with the other person. And if there's nobody sitting next to you, you do that pre-takeoff briefing to yourself so that those numbers stick in your head. You're not thinking of 500, you're thinking of 850 if you're at Palomar.
I really like that. And I got to admit, the last thing I do before takeoff, my last go, no-go thing, and we talk about go, no-go for a second. Before I even look at the airspeed indicator to see if I'm near rotation, I look at the TAC to make sure I have sufficient power. And I always point it out to the other person. I have what I'm expecting on the TAC. Now we continue, because if I go full power and on that takeoff roll, that's the first time for this day I've gone full power. If I'm rolling down the runway and I only see 2,200 RPM, we're done now. This ain't going to work. I don't want to hit the trees going real fast. Let's just give up. By the way, there's also Rob Smith has a habit, apparently, communication frequencies in COM 1, weather in COM 2. I go tower in COM 1, approach or departure in COM 2. So I've got the flip-flop happening right away. But that's me. I'm not saying I'm right. I'm just saying that's my thing. And Pat, bringing up the go, no-go rule, because we only got 5 minutes left. There's so much stuff to cover. There's never a point where we can't say, yeah, this is a no-go for whatever reason. You agree with that? That if at any point, if I don't like the weather in the briefing, if I don't like the condition of the plane, if there's something kind of weird in the fuel that I'm not familiar with, if just The winds are higher than I want. I don't feel very good now that I'm in the airplane taxiing. We can always say no go, can't we?
Yep, there's no shame in doing that, and that would I would imagine have saved a number of lives in the past. That I'm thinking of it doesn't. It just happened to pop into my mind. There was a crash here. Was probably 4 or 5 years ago in a Lance. It took off on a hot day. Four adults, full gas and baggage, and about on rotation, the baggage door in the front popped open, and it freaked him out so much, and he must have missed it on pre-flight. And that kind of goes back to the pre-flight. But anyway, they staggered into the air, and he tried to make a turn back to the airport without cleaning the airplane up, and basically just forgot to fly the airplane and crashed, and all 4 of them died. So that's I don't know what triggered that, but it relates back to a good thorough pre-flight, and if they had caught that. That would have been, yep, we can't go right now. Or if they'd had the presence of mind, because it actually popped open before they rotated, and they had plenty of runway to have stopped, but they didn't. So that was a real tragedy.
That's unfortunate. Yeah, having the presence of mind to know I don't have to go just because I'm halfway down the runway. By the way, Martin Castenbaum, I'm very sorry. You are off my Christmas card list for life. Any traffic in the area, please advise, is not something we ever want to say. If you come back and tell me you were sarcastic, I'll put you back on the Christmas card list. But we're coming up on the end of this. This has been really good. We've had a lot of material to cover. Viewers, if you got anything out of that, well, give me a thumbs up. Put it in the comments. Just let us know that you found this helpful. And of course, we really do want to be responsive to you. So if there's a topic you particularly want us to cover, let us know. Not Eric Pittman, because he's on vacation. It doesn't count. You're not allowed to do feedback. But Kay, you got any parting words for these fabulous people who took the time to listen to us tonight?
Well, take your time and do a good pre-flight briefing, and know the federal aviation regulations that pertain to that flight. And you don't have to be like Pat and memorize it, but know where to go, and like the seatbelts, if you're not sure, at least go and take a look and have all that information ready. It will make your time up in the air so much more enjoyable, and be really vigilant about when not to fly, because you are the pilot in command, and it's up to you to make that decision.
Yeah, I'm going to stick up for you, Pat. People make fun of you for reading the FARs. I don't think they realize you're on a years-long program to do the audiobook version. You're just doing it little bits at a time.
Yeah.
Come out. Anything you want to share with our spectacular audience before we depart the airwaves for whatever it is we do on our private time?
Well, I know Martin, and he was being sarcastic. Trust me, he was being sarcastic. So.
I appreciate the upside down smiley face.
No, I'll just tell you one quick story. I've got a very, very dear friend who, I don't know, I think he has a pathological aversion to checklists. I can't figure out why. And we were flying together one day, and he said, he was in the left seat. He said, "Hand me that checklist." We were taxiing out. He said, "Hand me that checklist." And I thought, geez, maybe I'm starting to rub off on him, and he's actually going to use the checklist. And he takes the checklist and he does this to kill a bug on the instrument panel. Then he hands me the checklist back as a thank you. So that's not what checklists are for, folks.
No, they are not. By the way, Kay, we skipped over this. You had a very good comment on a dry erase marker on a laminated checklist. I actually had a guy who was a helicopter pilot in Vietnam. He used to carry a grease pencil, and he would just write stuff on the plexi. So we've got stuff going for us. Rob Smith, I like this. Know your personal minimums. Share with your instructor or another pilot to keep you accountable. I like that. Folks, if you have a question, if you're concerned about something we said that you thought might be incorrect, or if you want to bring something to our attention that is so brilliant you didn't want to do it in a public setting, write to us, ambassadors@aopa.org, and one of us actually will answer you. We might even fight over who gets to respond because we love doing this so much. If you did enjoy this program, please click the like button on whichever social media platform you're on. And if you would, consider sharing the link with your friends and say, hey, that was worth watching, because Pat Brown is really smart. Kay's in California. I think she knows Brad Pitt. And, I'm here, so that's good enough. Folks, thanks a lot. I do appreciate it. It has been fun. As always, we will be back here on the fourth Tuesday of the month, which it says right here is August 23rd. If somebody can check me out on that. 7 o'clock Eastern, 4 o'clock Pacific. Somewhere in the middle, it's a different time than that. You'll have to figure it out yourself. I can't do that math in my head. Y'all have a great night. Pat, Kay, thank you. And Donnie, I appreciate you keeping the lights on for this whole thing. You did a masterful job. See y'all next time.
Good night.